When I came home for the summer, the house didn't feel the same. It wasn't the walls or the silence that followed me down the hallway, it was my brother, Caleb. He was different. Kinder, calmer, almost too careful, as though every word he spoke had been weighed before reaching me that we hadn't been close in years. Growing up, Caleb was the loud one, the type who filled every room with confidence and charm. I was the quiet shadow who watched from doorways, learning how to exist in his orbit. But that summer, when he met me at the door with a soft smile and took my bag from my shoulder, I couldn't ignore the shift. It wasn't just politeness. It was tenderness, strange, unfamiliar tenderness that he asked how university was going, and when I gave my usual half-answer, he didn't let it die there. He pressed on. "Are you still painting?" he asked. I told him I hadn't touched a brush in months. He frowned, not disappointed, but sad, like he'd failed to protect some small part of me. That night, he cooked dinner. Caleb, who once swore he'd rather starve than hold a spatula. The kitchen smelled like rosemary and something foreign, something expensive. He laughed when I asked if he'd replaced our mom's old recipes. "I'm trying new things," he said. "Change can be good." It should have been comforting, but instead, it felt rehearsed. Over the next few days, I watched him carefully. The way his phone was never far from reach. The subtle smile that appeared when he read certain messages. The pause before he answered if I asked who was calling. Caleb had always been direct, but now he hid things behind warmth. The change was too deliberate to be natural. Ava came by once that week, his fiancée. She was as radiant as ever, all poise and perfume, her laughter echoing through the house like old times. They looked happy enough, but I caught something in Caleb's eyes when she hugged him, a distance, a flicker of guilt maybe, or exhaustion. When she left, he sat on the porch for nearly an hour, staring at nothing, his hand pressed against his phone as though afraid of what waited inside it. One evening, I found him in the garage, fixing his old motorcycle. He didn't notice me at first. His lips moved faintly, whispering something I couldn't catch. When I asked who he was talking to, he startled. "Just thinking out loud," he said. But his hands were trembling slightly, and that wasn't like him. That I tried convincing myself it wasn't my business. But the feeling gnawed at me, the sense that something invisible had settled between us. Then came the night I couldn't ignore it anymore. It was past midnight. The air was heavy, and I couldn't sleep. I went downstairs for water, and as I passed the hallway, I heard him. His voice, low and soft, drifting from his room. At first, I thought he was praying, it had that kind of quiet intensity. But then I heard a name, Noah. I froze. The way he said it wasn't casual. It carried weight, tenderness, longing. I stood there, glass in hand, listening to fragments of words I couldn't piece together. "I wish things were different," he whispered, and the silence that followed felt like a door closing. That I didn't move until I heard the faint sound of him laughing, small, nervous, aching. Then the creak of the floorboards as he turned off the light. Back in my room, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the word Noah echoing in my mind. I knew the name. Caleb's college friend. The one who'd always been around before Ava. The one he stopped mentioning 2 years ago. The next morning, Caleb was making coffee when I came down. His eyes were tired but bright. "Morning, kid," he said, using the nickname I hadn't heard in years. He slid a mug toward me, black coffee just the way I liked it. Something in me wanted to ask about the call. To break the spell of politeness that had replaced our honesty. But then he smiled, gentle, real, and I couldn't. That smile was fragile, and I was afraid of what would happen if I touched it. Later that afternoon, I did laundry for the both of us. When I reached into his jeans pocket, something slipped out, a small folded piece of paper. It was faintly creased, like it had been opened many times. On it, in unfamiliar handwriting, were the words, "You make me feel seen again." And I read it twice. 3 times. The paper trembled in my hand. My first thought was of Ava, but she wouldn't sign her name with just an initial. And then I remembered the whisper, Noah. That I placed the note back exactly where I found it, That evening, Caleb joined me on the porch as the sky dimmed into orange and ash. He didn't say much, just sat beside me with a quiet peace that didn't belong to the man I used to know. When he finally spoke, his voice carried that same softness that unsettled me from the start. "You ever think people change?" he said, "not because they want to, but because they have to?" I nodded, though I didn't understand that he looked out at the street, his eyes glassy from the fading light. Sometimes kindness is just another kind of apology. I didn't ask what he meant. I couldn't. There was too much between us, too many questions forming like storm clouds that neither of us was ready to face. When night fell, I watched him disappear into his room again, closing the door behind him with a careful hand. The faint hum of his voice reached me through the walls, softer now, almost like a lullaby. I lay in bed with the windows open, the air cool against my skin, thinking about how everything had changed without a single explanation. My brother was kinder, yes, but in his kindness, I heard the echo of something breaking, and as I drifted toward sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had changed in him had already begun to change me too. The days that followed settled into a strange rhythm. I would see Daniel outside most evenings, sitting on the porch with a quiet patience, as if waiting for something that no longer existed. I began to find excuses to walk past his house, to check the mail, to water a plant I barely cared for, to pretend I had a reason to be near him. Each time, he looked a little different, sometimes shaven and calm, sometimes lost in thought, and sometimes holding that same half-empty beer bottle, like a habit he couldn't break. One Thursday evening, he called out to me. "Ethan," he said, leaning over the fence, "you're always out here alone. You ever eat dinner with someone, or is solitude your thing too?" I smiled, caught off guard by the sudden familiarity. "Depends who's asking. Someone who's tired of takeout and silence." That was how it began, dinners that felt harmless, ordinary. The first night, we ordered Chinese food and sat in his living room, the air filled with the faint scent of soy and ginger. The space felt strangely hollow, like a house rearranging itself after being emptied. I noticed that the walls were bare where picture frames had once hung. There was a faint tan line where Clara's photos used to be. He caught me looking. "She took the frames, too," he said, without bitterness. "Didn't even leave the nails." We both laughed, but it was a quiet, tired kind of laughter. Our conversations drifted from small talk into something heavier, like water seeping through a crack. Daniel spoke about his marriage the way some people talk about weather, inevitable, unchangeable. "We stopped talking years before we stopped being married," he said. I just didn't notice the silence anymore. I listened, unsure what role I played in his healing, a neighbor, a witness, or something he hadn't named yet. I told him about my own failed relationships, about how I'd learned to fill loneliness with work and distraction. He smiled faintly. "Guess we're both specialists in pretending." The more time we spent together, the more I began to recognize the small details of him, the way he rubbed the back of his neck when he was uncertain, the pause he took before admitting anything personal, the low hum he made when he was thinking. There was no clear moment when concern turned into something else, but I started to feel it, a quiet pull I couldn't rationalize. One evening, I found him fixing a loose porch step. He was wearing an old gray t-shirt, the kind softened by years of wear. His forearms were streaked with sawdust. He looked up and grinned. "Want to hand me that screwdriver?" I did, and as our fingers brushed, something unspoken passed between us, fleeting but unmistakable. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then continued working as if nothing had happened. I tried to act natural, but my heart gave itself away. When the step was done, he sat back and sighed. "You ever feel like you're rebuilding something you know will never be the same again?" I nodded. "All the time." He looked at me, eyes catching the fading light. "That's what this house feels like. Every nail I drive in just reminds me of what's missing." That night, the air turned colder. A thin drizzle began, and the smell of wet soil filled the neighborhood. I helped him carry the tools inside. His living room was dim, the light of a single lamp stretching long shadows across the floor. Music played softly from a speaker, something slow and instrumental. "Stay for a bit," he said. It's miserable out there. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, our conversation wandering. He asked me about my family, my work, my reasons for staying in this town. I answered honestly, though I could feel his attention resting on more than my words. The rain intensified, tapping steadily against the windows. At one point, he leaned back and exhaled. "It's strange," he said. "I spent years trying to be what she wanted, strong, reliable, predictable. But in the end, none of that mattered. She said I'd become a stranger. Maybe she just stopped seeing you," I said quietly. He turned to me, eyes searching. "Do you?" The question hung between us, heavier than it should have been. I could hear the sound of the rain, the slow rhythm of my heartbeat, and the space between his words. I wanted to look away, but I didn't. "No," I said finally. "I see you." Something shifted in the air then, like the pause before a storm breaks. He didn't speak, but his gaze lingered long enough for meaning to settle. The moment didn't need words, it lived in the silence, in the closeness of two people who had nowhere else to place their loneliness. A flash of lightning briefly illuminated the room. We both flinched, half laughing at our reaction, but the tension remained, quiet, fragile, real. He reached for the remote to turn the music down, and his hand brushed my knee. He froze, then pulled back, muttering, "Sorry." "Don't be," I said before I could stop myself. He looked at me again, the apology fading from his face, replaced by something else, a kind of recognition neither of us had wanted to admit. The rain outside softened, turning into a steady whisper. We sat there in silence, the distance between us shrinking until it wasn't just physical anymore. I could feel the weight of what wasn't being said pressing into the air around us. I thought about how dangerous it was, not in the obvious sense, but in the quiet, emotional way that leaves marks you can't explain. He was the first to move. Slowly, he stood, walked to the window, and stared out at the dark street. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore," he said. "Every time I start to feel alive again, it feels like betrayal." "Maybe it's just healing," I said. "They look the same sometimes." He didn't answer, just nodded faintly, his reflection a shadow against the glass. Then he turned back to me. "You should probably head home. It's late." The dismissal was gentle, not cold. I stood, unsure of what to say, feeling the moment slip between us like smoke. As I reached the door, he spoke again, softly, almost as if to himself, "Thank you for staying." I hesitated. "You don't have to thank me." He smiled, small, tired, and real. "I think I do." Outside, the rain had stopped, but the world still smelled of it, damp earth, clean air, a kind of freshness that felt undeserved. I walked the short distance to my house, feeling both lighter and heavier at once. Later that night, lying in bed, I replayed the evening in my mind, every glance, every silence, every word left hanging. There had been no confession, no touch that crossed a line, yet everything in me knew that something irreversible had begun. Through the thin wall, I could hear faint movement again, footsteps, maybe, or a restless soul pacing in the dark. I wondered if Daniel was awake too, haunted by the same questions. Before I fell asleep, one thought settled in me with quiet certainty: whatever we had become, it wasn't just neighbors anymore. And whatever was coming next, neither of us was ready to name it. The morning after the storm was unnervingly still. The mountains wore a fresh layer of mist, and the air outside the cabin smelled clean, too clean, as though the night before had been washed away. Ethan woke to silence, broken only by the slow crackle of new firewood and the faint sound of water dripping from the roof. His head felt heavy, not from wine, but from everything that had gone unsaid. Caleb stood by the counter, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. His expression was unreadable, calm, almost casual, but something beneath it had changed. His voice when he spoke was soft, careful. "You sleep at all?" Ethan shook his head. "Barely." Caleb handed him a mug. "Yeah. Me neither." They sat across from each other, separated by the narrow table that suddenly felt like a chasm. The quiet wasn't comfortable this time. It was thick, weighted with what they hadn't done but almost had. Ethan stared into his cup, the rising steam blurring his reflection. He wanted to say something, apologize, explain, retreat, but no words fit. Finally, Caleb broke the silence. We should probably head back before the road's ice over. Ethan nodded, grateful for the practicality of the statement. Yeah. Let's do that. They packed in silence. Every small sound, the zip of a bag, the creak of the floorboards, the closing of drawers, felt exaggerated, like punctuation in a conversation neither wanted to finish. When Caleb brushed past him to grab his jacket, Ethan's heart jumped despite himself. The nearness hurt more than the distance ever could. Before leaving, Ethan stepped outside for air. The sky was pale, the valley below hidden under slow-moving fog. He closed his eyes, letting the cold bite at his skin. He told himself this would fade, that time and reason would erase the sharpness of what had almost happened. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't. Some moments refused to dissolve. Caleb came out behind him. You ready? Ethan nodded without turning around. Yeah. The drive down the mountain was quiet. The winding roads felt endless, and each curve brought a new kind of tension, the kind that comes from knowing silence is safer than truth. Caleb focused on the road, his jaw tight, knuckles pale against the steering wheel. Ethan watched the landscape blur past, trees melting into shades of gray and green. He wanted to say something that could make the air lighter, but everything that came to mind felt dishonest. Halfway down, Caleb finally spoke. You don't have to hate me for last night. Ethan turned to him. I don't. Caleb's eyes stayed on the road. Then what do you feel? Ethan exhaled slowly. Confused. Guilty. Maybe both. About me? About everything. Caleb gave a faint nod, almost to himself. I didn't plan it, you know. I know. Ethan paused. That doesn't make it easier. They drove the rest of the way in silence. By the time they reached the highway, the sun had climbed above the trees, melting what little snow remained. The world looked ordinary again, and that felt like a lie. When Caleb dropped him off at his apartment, he didn't kill the engine. Ethan unbuckled his seatbelt but didn't move to leave. For a long moment, they sat in stillness. Caleb broke it first. Take care of yourself, Ethan. Ethan nodded, his throat tight. You too. He stepped out, closed the door, and stood on the curb as the truck pulled away. The sound of its tires faded into city noise until it was gone entirely. For the first time in days, Ethan felt utterly alone. Inside, Ryan was home early. He looked up from the couch, smiling with that easy familiarity Ethan had always found comforting. Hey, you're back sooner than I thought. How was it? Ethan managed a smile. Peaceful. Ryan stood, stretching, then crossed over to hug him. You needed it. Ethan let himself be held, but it felt strange, like fitting into a shape that no longer matched perfectly. Ryan smelled like coffee and cedar soap, the same as always. Nothing had changed here, and that was the problem. As the evening went on, Ryan talked about work, about a project deadline, about weekend plans. Ethan listened, nodding at the right moments, pretending everything was fine. But part of him still lingered in that cabin, by the fire, in the sound of rain, in Caleb's voice whispering truths neither could bear to hold. Later that night, while Ryan slept, Ethan sat by the window with his phone. One unread message glowed on the screen. Caleb, I didn't plan it. But I don't regret feeling something real. Ethan's thumb hovered over the delete button. He didn't reply. Instead, he locked the screen and set the phone face down. But the words stayed, echoing like a heartbeat. He stared out at the city lights scattered across the dark. It was strange how easily life resumed, how routine could disguise turmoil. Yet inside, a quiet storm still moved. Guilt pressed at him, but beneath it lay something harder to name, a longing not for what happened, but for what it revealed. He wondered what it said about him, that a single weekend could shake years of certainty. That a glance, a touch, a near mistake could make him question what he thought he knew about love and loyalty. By midnight, the room had gone completely still. Ryan shifted in his sleep, murmuring something unintelligible. Ethan watched him, the faint rise and fall of his chest, the trust in his unguarded face. He wanted to reach out, to bridge the distance between them, but couldn't. The space felt sacred now, something he wasn't sure he had the right to cross. When dawn approached, pale and thin, Ethan still hadn't slept. He went to the kitchen, made coffee, and stood by the window as the first light touched the skyline. His reflection looked older, quieter, changed in ways no one would notice. That he thought of the mountains, of how they seemed eternal from afar, but up close, every surface told a story of erosion, of weather, of time reshaping even the strongest stone. Maybe people weren't so different. Caleb would fade, he told himself. The memory would dull, the guilt would soften. But part of him knew better. Some stories don't end, they just become quieter versions of themselves, hidden in the folds of ordinary life. Ethan took a slow breath and whispered to the empty room, "The mountains keep secrets." Then, almost to himself, softer still, "So do I." He set the mug down, straightened his posture, and turned toward the day waiting for him, but as the sunlight broke across the room, he couldn't quite shake the feeling that something inside him had shifted for good, and that the silence he carried from that cabin would follow him long after everything else had been forgotten.